Hello everyone, I am very glad that you're joining this story. Subscribe, like and comment. Enjoy the story, smile more often.
The room was filled with the low hum of conversation, the clinking of glasses, and the occasional burst of laughter as family members leaned in to exchange hushed gossip over plates of expensive steak and imported wine. The private dining hall had been reserved for the occasion, the long mahogany table gleaming under the soft glow of the chandelier, a picture-perfect setting for what was supposed to be a celebration of my father's birthday. But even as the servers moved between guests, refilling glasses and delivering perfectly plated meals, I could feel something heavy in the air, something unspoken but undeniable, something that made the edges of my mother's perfectly curated smile just a little too sharp. I had learned, over the years, to recognize that smile, the one she wore when she was about to deliver a blow disguised as an act of kindness, the one that made it seem like she was offering something generous when, in reality, she was taking something away. And so, when she finally cleared her throat, tapping the side of her crystal glass with the tip of her manicured nail, I just knew, that whatever was about to come out of her mouth would be something meant to remind me exactly where I stood in this family. "Before we raise our glasses for the toast," she said, her voice carrying the smooth confidence of a woman who had spent decades orchestrating these kinds of moments, "I just want to take a second to acknowledge something very important to your father's legacy." She paused for effect, glancing toward my brother, Jack, who was already smiling as if he knew exactly what was coming next. "It brings me so much pride to finally share what we have all known for years, that Jack will be inheriting Walker Steelworks, just as his father always intended." The words hit harder than I expected, knocking the air from my lungs in a way that almost made me laugh because, really, how could I still be surprised? I had spent my entire life being told without being told that I was never going to be part of the legacy my father built, that my role in this family was nothing more than a supporting act, that my existence was acknowledged but never truly valued. And yet, despite knowing all of that, despite expecting this very moment, there was something about hearing it out loud, something about the way she said it so effortlessly, so publicly, so completely, that made it feel like I had just been kicked in the stomach. I set my fork down slowly, methodically, forcing myself to breathe evenly as the words settled into the space around us, as Jack grinned like a man who had just been handed the keys to a kingdom he hadn't even worked to earn. There was a murmur of polite applause from the relatives who had always seen me as little more than the daughter who didn't belong, a few raised glasses, a couple of murmured congratulations, from people who wouldn't have cared if I had disappeared off the face of the earth entirely. My mother looked so pleased with herself, so utterly satisfied with this grand declaration of my insignificance, that I almost wanted to let her sit with it, let her believe she had finally succeeded in writing me out of the family history. But then, before I could even open my mouth, a chair scraped against the polished floor, the sound cutting through the low hum of conversation like a blade. I turned just in time to see my lawyer, Mr. Caldwell, rising to his feet, his expression composed, but carrying a weight that made my mother's smile falter for the first time that evening. He cleared his throat, adjusting the cuffs of his suit as he glanced toward Jack, then back at my mother, before finally settling his gaze on me. "With all due respect, Mrs. Walker," he said, his voice carrying just enough polite authority to make the entire room go silent, "I believe you may be mistaken about the future of Walker Steelworks." The air shifted, the mood of the evening cracking like glass under pressure, the weight of uncertainty replacing the shallow excitement that had just filled the room. My mother's smile flickered, a brief moment of hesitation passing over her face before she recovered, tilting her head in that condescending way she always did when she was preparing to dismiss someone beneath her. "I don't think I am," she said smoothly, though I could see the slight tension in her fingers as they curled around the stem of her wine glass. "This decision was made long ago, and there is nothing, actually, Mr. Caldwell interrupted, and for the first time in my life, I watched my mother's confidence waver. Jack never inherited the company, because, as of 3 months ago, he no longer owned it. A stunned silence rippled across the table, the quiet so sharp that I could almost hear the moment my brother's world cracked apart, the moment he realized that the crown he had been so confidently wearing didn't exist at all. His brows pulled together in confusion, the smugness draining from his face as he turned toward my mother, his voice coming out tight, strained, laced with something that almost sounded like panic. "What the hell does that mean?" Jack asked, his voice louder than necessary, a desperate edge creeping in that made my pulse race with satisfaction. Mr. Caldwell adjusted his glasses, flipping open the folder he had placed on the table, sliding a signed contract forward so that everyone could see. "It means," he continued, his voice perfectly even, "that your husband, Mr. Daniel Walker, executed a legally binding sale agreement, transferring full ownership of Walker Steelworks to your wife, Emma Walker." My brother's jaw dropped, his mouth opening and closing like a man struggling to breathe through a punch he never saw coming, his eyes darting between me and Daniel as if he were waiting for someone to tell him this was all some kind of sick joke. My mother, for the first time in my entire life, looked completely speechless, her fingers twitching slightly as she stared at the contract in front of her, as if by sheer force of will, she could make the words disappear. "And me?" I sat back in my chair, reached for my glass of wine, took a slow sip, and smiled. The stunned silence at the table lingered far longer than I expected, stretching out in awkward, uncomfortable waves as my mother's carefully maintained composure began to crack at the edges. Her lips slightly parted as if her brain was still struggling to process the reality that had just been handed to her. My brother, who had always walked through life with the certainty of a man who never had to earn a single thing he was given, looked as though someone had physically knocked the air from his lungs. His hands clenched tightly against the table as if gripping onto something that could ground him in the face of his own unraveling. And yet, despite the absolute satisfaction of watching them both squirm under the weight of their own expectations crumbling, I couldn't shake the memory of how we got to this point. How I had spent years standing in the shadow of a legacy that was never meant to include me. From the moment I was old enough to understand how things worked in our family, it had been painfully clear that Jack was the chosen one, the golden boy, the heir apparent to my father's empire. The son who could do no wrong no matter how many mistakes he made along the way. My father, Robert Walker, had built Walker Steelworks from nothing, turning a small fabrication shop into a multimillion-dollar empire that supplied steel for some of the biggest developments in the country. A business that should have belonged to both his children, but was instead treated like something that was meant for Jack alone. It wasn't that my father ever outright said the words, never that he openly declared I was unwelcome in the company he had spent his life building, but it was there, in the way he spoke to me, in the way he dismissed my ideas. In the way he would always say, "That's not something you need to worry about, sweetheart," whenever I asked about the business. Jack, on the other hand, had never lifted a single finger to prove himself worthy of the responsibility he was handed on a silver platter, had never once been expected to put in the same effort, had never once been told he needed to be more, do more, try harder. While I spent summers studying business strategies and trying to learn everything I could about the industry, he was out partying on yachts with trust fund kids who had never worked a day in their lives. While I sat quietly at board meetings, taking notes, observing, waiting for my opportunity to contribute, he waltzed in late with a cocky grin and a half-hearted excuse, knowing that no one would ever hold it against him. And my mother? She had made it perfectly clear where she stood, had never once attempted to hide the fact that she believed my purpose in life wasn't to lead, but to support, to stand beside a man rather than be the one in charge. She used to say it in little ways, dropping hints in casual conversation, always with that same sickly sweet tone that made her words feel less like advice and more like chains tightening around my neck. "Women don't run businesses, darling, they marry into them." I had been 15 years old the first time she said it, too young to understand that she wasn't offering guidance, she was issuing a warning. For years, I tried to prove myself in small ways, tried to carve out a place where I could be recognized, where I could contribute, where I could show them that I wasn't just some outsider looking in on a world that should have been mine, too. But no matter what I did, no matter how much effort I put in, it was never enough, never acknowledged, never even considered in the equation of who would take over the business one day. And then, one day, I stopped trying to be part of their world, stopped waiting for permission, stopped hoping for validation that was never going to come. I realized that if I wanted a seat at the table, I wasn't going to ask for it. I was going to take it. The plan didn't come together overnight, didn't happen in one grand, sweeping moment of realization. It was slow, calculated, built piece by piece over years of quiet observation, of waiting. Of watching Jack fumble every single opportunity he was given and knowing that eventually he was going to make a mistake so big, so irreversible, that I could use it against him. The moment came in the form of his divorce, a messy, drawn-out disaster that cost him far more than he ever anticipated, a financial hemorrhage that he thought he could fix by pulling from the company, only to realize too late that there was nothing left to pull from. The key to everything had been Samantha, his ex-wife, the woman he had stupidly underestimated, the woman he had thought he could walk all over and leave behind without consequence. Samantha was bitter, she was angry, and more importantly, she was willing to do whatever it took to get back at him. I remember the night I met her for drinks, the way she swirled the wine in her glass before leaning in just enough to let me know she was about to say something that would change everything. "If you're looking for leverage, I have it," she had said, her voice laced with the kind of satisfaction that only comes from knowing you finally found the weak spot in the person who wronged you. "But it's going to cost you." I didn't even blink before pulling out my checkbook. Jack was drowning in legal fees, trying to salvage what little dignity he had left, and when Daniel approached him with an offer to quietly buy out his shares before he lost everything, it had been the easiest decision he ever made, and the worst mistake of his life. I pulled myself out of the memory, my gaze shifting back to my brother, who still looked as though someone had yanked the rug out from under him, his fingers tightening around the edge of the table as he shook his head in disbelief. "You're lying," he said, his voice hollow, weak as if he couldn't even convince himself. I exhaled slowly, letting the moment stretch, letting him sit in it, letting the weight of his own failure settle on his shoulders before tilting my head slightly, my lips curling into a slow, deliberate smile. "No, Jack," I said, my voice dripping with satisfaction. "I just played the game better than you did." Jack's face had gone pale, his hands clenched into fists at his sides, his entire body rigid with the kind of anger that only comes from realizing too late that you've been outplayed in a game you never even knew you were losing. The silence that stretched between us was thick, suffocating, the kind that made every second feel like an eternity, and yet I let it linger, let him sit in the wreckage of his own arrogance, let him stew in the realization that everything he had taken for granted had been methodically stripped away while he was too busy coasting through life on the assumption that nothing could ever touch him. I had spent years waiting for this moment, watching him stumble through board meetings with half-hearted interest, listening to him make promises he never intended to keep, and biting my tongue every time he dismissed my suggestions with that same smug, condescending smirk that had haunted me since childhood. Jack had never worked a single day in his life for anything that mattered, never had to fight for a place at the table, never had to prove himself in a world that was already built for him to succeed. And yet, despite having every advantage, despite being handed a business worth millions, he had still managed to burn it to the ground with nothing more than his own incompetence. The cracks had started showing long before I made my move, long before Daniel stepped in, long before I sat across from Samantha and saw the raw, simmering hatred in her eyes as she spoke about the man who had left her to pick up the pieces of a life he had casually tossed aside. I had known, from the second I saw the divorce papers, that Jack was in trouble, that the weight of his own reckless decisions was finally going to catch up with him, and I had been patient, biding my time, waiting for the exact moment when his desperation would make him vulnerable. And that moment had come sooner than I expected. Jack had never been good with money, had never understood the concept of limits, had never once considered that there might come a day when his endless safety net of wealth and privilege wouldn't be there to catch him. When the divorce settlement wiped out a significant portion of his assets, he did what he always did. He threw himself into even more reckless spending, convinced that if he just kept playing the game, if he kept taking risks, everything would magically turn around in his favor. He had convinced himself that the best way to recover from his financial free fall was to invest in risky expansion projects, pouring company funds into failed ventures, bad partnerships, and overpriced acquisitions that led to nothing but massive losses. And then, when the walls started closing in, when the board members started asking questions, when the financial reports painted an undeniable picture of disaster, he did what he had always done. He looked for someone to bail him out. That was when Daniel stepped in. Jack had been too arrogant to see it coming, too desperate to consider the possibility that the man offering to save him might have ulterior motives, too blinded by his own belief that everything would somehow work out for him in the end. When Daniel came to him with an offer, a discreet buyout, a quiet transaction that would keep the media and board members from seeing just how badly he had failed, Jack had accepted it without hesitation, thinking he was outsmarting the system, thinking he could take the money, walk away, and start over somewhere else without anyone knowing just how close he had come to losing everything. But what he hadn't realized, what he had never even considered, was that Daniel wasn't just some investor looking for a deal. Daniel had been working with me the entire time. The moment the ink dried on that contract, the moment Jack signed away his last remaining shares in Walker Steelworks, the company he had once believed was his birthright became mine. And by the time he realized what had happened, by the time he understood that he had just sold his father's legacy to the one person he had spent his entire life trying to push out, it was already too late. The sound of Jack's chair scraping against the floor jolted me from my thoughts, his movements jerky and erratic as he shoved the contract across the table, his eyes wild with fury, his entire body shaking with barely restrained rage. "You set me up," he hissed, his voice low, sharp, cutting through the tense silence like a blade. "You and your husband, you planned this." I exhaled slowly, tilting my head slightly, watching him unravel with the kind of detached amusement that only comes from knowing you hold all the power. "Planned?" I repeated, my lips curling into a slow, deliberate smile. "Jack, you did this to yourself." His jaw clenched so tightly I thought his teeth might crack, his fingers digging into the edge of the table as he leaned forward, his voice dropping into something almost desperate. "You tricked me," he accused, his tone laced with betrayal, as if he had expected loyalty from someone he had spent a lifetime treating like an afterthought. I reached into my bag before he could finish, pulling out a neatly organized folder and sliding it across the table toward him, watching as he hesitated before snatching it up with shaking hands. "Those," I said calmly, "are the financial reports from the last 2 years, the failed investments you made, the projects you approved without proper oversight, and the money you funneled out of the company to cover your personal debts." I folded my hands in my lap, watching the way his face drained of color as he flipped through the pages, the reality of his own self-inflicted downfall staring him in the face. "And those," I continued, my voice steady, controlled, merciless, "are the emails between you and your financial advisor, proving that you knew exactly how deep in trouble you were months before Daniel ever approached you with the buyout offer." I leaned forward slightly, dropping my voice just enough to make sure every word cut deep. "So tell me, Jack, did I trick you? Or did you just dig your own grave and hand me the shovel?" He didn't answer, didn't speak, didn't even move, his entire body locked in place as he stared at the evidence of his own mistakes, the weight of his own downfall pressing down on him like a crushing force he couldn't escape. And I just sat there, watching him break, because for the first time in my life, I wasn't the one being left behind. The silence in the dining hall was unbearable, stretching out like an open wound, raw and exposed, the weight of it pressing down on everyone at the table as Jack stared blankly at the folder in front of him, his face drained of all color, his breathing shallow, his fingers twitching like he was barely holding himself together. I watched him with quiet detachment, my expression carefully unreadable, not because I didn't feel anything but because I refused to give him the satisfaction of knowing that any part of me still cared about what he thought, still cared about how he looked at me, still cared about the way my mother was sitting stiffly at the other end of the table, her hands clenched into fists against the white linen, her lips pressed so tightly together that I could see the muscles in her jaw twitching from the force of it. I knew what was coming next, could feel the storm building before she even took her first deep, steadying breath, could see it in the way her nostrils flared slightly, the way her spine straightened, the way her carefully constructed mask of polite society grace cracked, just enough for the first glimmer of rage to slip through. My mother, Eleanor Walker, had spent her entire life controlling the narrative, making sure that the world saw exactly what she wanted them to see, and now, in the span of a single evening, she had lost that control in the worst possible way, publicly. Humiliatingly, in front of the very people she had spent years molding into an audience that would always applaud her carefully orchestrated performances. Her chair scraped against the floor as she pushed back from the table, the sound slicing through the silence like a blade, sharp and jarring, drawing every eye toward her as she rose to her full height, shoulders squared, chin lifted. Her carefully styled hair still perfectly in place despite the fact that her world had just been set on fire. When she finally spoke, her voice was low, measured, carrying the kind of venom that didn't need to be shouted to be deadly, the kind of quiet fury that had been sharpened over decades of using words as weapons. "You ungrateful little girl," she said, her tone almost too calm, too controlled, a dangerous edge lacing every syllable as she fixed me with a look that I had spent my entire life fearing, the look that had once made me shrink under its weight, made me question everything about myself, made me doubt my own worth just because she had deemed me unworthy. But not tonight. Not anymore. I tilted my head slightly, feigning curiosity, giving her nothing, offering her not even a fraction of the reaction she wanted, watching as her fingers twitched at her sides, watching as she realized that her anger no longer had power over me. "You betrayed this family," she continued, her voice growing sharper, louder, a slight shake in her hands betraying just how deeply this loss had cut her, just how much losing to me had shattered the illusion she had built around herself. "After everything we did for you, after everything we gave you, after all the sacrifices we made, this," she gestured wildly to the folder still sitting on the table between me and Jack, her eyes flashing with something that almost looked like genuine hatred. "This is how you repay us?" I let out a slow breath, my lips curving into something that might have been a smile if there had been any humor left in me to give. "You never considered me family when it actually mattered," I said, my voice level, my gaze steady, watching as something in her expression flickered, something that might have been doubt or realization. Or maybe just the first cracks in the foundation of the lie she had been telling herself for years. "You only call it betrayal when it doesn't benefit you." Jack, who had been unnervingly quiet up until that moment, finally snapped out of his stunned silence, slamming his hands against the table so hard that several glasses rattled against the wood, his breath coming in short, ragged bursts as if he was trying to hold back the full force of his rage. "This isn't over," he spat, his voice laced with something ugly, something dangerous, something that told me he was not the type to go down without a fight. "You think you can just take everything from me? You think you can just pull this stunt and get away with it?" I didn't flinch, didn't even blink, just watched him with the same quiet patience that I had always had to practice when we were children, when he would throw tantrums over toys he didn't want until I had them, over attention he didn't need until it was given to me. "Jack," I said, sighing as I leaned forward slightly, folding my hands neatly on the table, making sure to hold his gaze so he understood, so he knew, so there would be no room left for doubt. "You did this to yourself." His face twisted, his jaw tightening, his entire body coiled with frustration, but before he could spew whatever last-ditch excuse he had prepared, before he could threaten me with whatever pitiful attempt at retaliation was brewing in his mind, Mr. Caldwell, who had been watching this all unfold with the composed patience of a man who had seen 1,000 business meltdowns before this one, cleared his throat and pulled another document from his briefcase, sliding it smoothly across the table. Toward Jack. "If you're considering legal action, Mr. Walker," he said, his voice polite but firm, the kind of tone that carried the weight of absolute certainty, "I would strongly advise you to review the contract you signed before you do anything you'll regret." He adjusted his glasses, glancing at Jack with the mild disinterest of a man who knew exactly how this was going to play out. You forfeited all ownership rights, relinquished all claims, and agreed to the terms without coercion. I have the signed affidavits to prove it." Jack's fingers twitched at his sides, his face twisted in frustration, his mind clearly scrambling for a way out, for some loophole, for some last-ditch attempt to undo what had already been done. But there was nothing. He had lost, and he knew it. The room fell into another silence, thick and heavy, but this time it wasn't mine to break. It belonged to my mother, who was still standing stiffly at the head of the table, her gaze locked onto me, something desperate flashing behind her eyes as she took a slow, careful breath, softening her voice just enough to make it clear that she was about to beg. "Emma," she said, the venom suddenly gone, replaced with something almost pathetic in its transparency, the last tool in her arsenal finally being pulled out of its case. "Please. We're still family." I stared at her for a long moment, waiting for the anger to return, waiting for the coldness, waiting for the mother I had always known to reappear beneath the surface. But she didn't, or maybe she did, and just finally realized there was nothing left to fight for. I pushed my chair back, stood up, and smoothed out my dress before meeting her gaze one last time. "No," I said simply, shaking my head. "We're not." The walk from the dining hall to the front entrance of the restaurant felt longer than it should have, the echoes of my mother's last desperate plea still ringing faintly in my ears, the weight of years of rejection pressing against my spine. But for the first time in my life, I did not carry it as a burden. I let it roll off me like rain against stone, let it fall away like the useless remnants of a past that no longer had a hold on me, let it dissipate into nothingness, because that was exactly what it deserved to be, nothing. I had spent years waiting for them to see me, for them to acknowledge my worth, for them to treat me like something other than a backup plan, an afterthought, an inconvenient presence they had to tolerate rather than a daughter they could love. But standing in that room, listening to them scramble for control of a situation that had already been sealed, I realized that I no longer cared whether they saw me or not. The fallout from the night's events had already begun, the quiet murmurs from extended relatives who had watched everything unfold with wide, stunned eyes, the awkward shuffling of those who had spent years reinforcing the belief that Jack was the golden son and I was simply an accessory to the family name. They wouldn't say it outright, wouldn't admit that they had been wrong, but I could see it in the way they refused to meet my gaze, in the way they suddenly looked at Jack with something dangerously close to pity rather than admiration. I had shattered the illusion, torn apart the story they had been telling themselves for years, forced them to see what had been true all along. Jack was never fit to run the company, and I had always been the only one who could. By the time Daniel and I stepped outside into the cool night air, my shoulders had relaxed, my breath coming easier, the tightness in my chest finally loosening in a way I hadn't realized I needed. Daniel, who had remained calm throughout the entire ordeal, reached for my hand, his fingers warm and steady against mine, a silent confirmation that he had always known this moment would come, that he had always believed I would take what was rightfully mine, even when I had doubted myself. I turned to him then, searching his face for something I couldn't quite name, something that had been lingering just beneath the surface since the moment I signed my name on the contract that changed everything. "Do you think I was ruthless?" I asked, my voice quieter than I intended, the question slipping out before I had the chance to stop it, before I could remind myself that I didn't need validation, that I didn't need permission to be exactly who I had become. But Daniel didn't hesitate, didn't even blink before giving me the only answer that mattered. "No," he said simply, his thumb brushing lightly against the back of my hand. "I think you finally started playing the game by their rules." The words settled deep in my chest, grounding me in a way that nothing else had, confirming what I already knew to be true. I hadn't been cruel. I hadn't been vindictive. I had simply stopped letting them dictate my place in a world that should have been mine from the start. The following weeks were filled with a different kind of chaos, the kind that came with undoing the damage Jack had done to the company, the kind that required long hours, difficult decisions, and the quiet satisfaction of watching everything fall into place exactly as I had envisioned. The first thing I did was remove every trace of Jack from the business, every reckless decision, every wasted dollar, every poor investment he had thrown into a pit of incompetence and greed. His name was wiped from the executive roster, his access revoked, his title stripped away as if he had never been there at all, because, in truth, he never really had been. Eleanor, still clinging to whatever remained of her influence, had tried to push back, had sent emails, made calls, attempted to appeal to board members who had once fallen at her feet, but her power was gone, just like Jack's, just like the illusion she had spent decades carefully curating. No one wanted to be associated with the mother who had orchestrated her son's downfall or the son who had foolishly thrown away a multi-million-dollar empire. They were relics of a past that no longer had a place in the world I was building, and by the end of the first quarter, Walker Steelworks was fully mine in both name and reputation. I rebranded, not because I needed to erase the past, but because I wanted to remind everyone that this company was no longer a relic of my father's legacy, but something new, something stronger, something that had finally found the right hands to guide it forward. The first official meeting under my leadership was held in the same boardroom where I had once been ignored, once been dismissed, once been told I was not cut out for this, and as I stood at the head of the table, a place I had fought to earn. I took a moment to let it sink in, to let the weight of everything I had built settle around me, to let the satisfaction of proving them all wrong wash over me in full. Later that evening, long after the offices had emptied, after the work had been done, after the last traces of my former life had been stripped away, Daniel and I sat together in our home, glasses of wine in hand, the quiet hum of the city stretching out beyond the windows. There was no grand celebration, no extravagant party to mark the occasion, no parade of people offering empty congratulations, because the only people who mattered were the ones who had been there all along. I took a sip of my wine, my gaze drifting toward Daniel, who watched me with quiet admiration, a knowing look in his eyes that told me he had always seen this version of me, even when I hadn't. "Do you regret it?" he asked, tilting his head slightly, studying me in the way only he could, the way that made me feel as though he already knew the answer, but wanted to hear me say it out loud. I thought about it for a moment, thought about the years of being overlooked, the quiet ache of never being enough, the weight of always being second place in a race I had been born into, but never allowed to run. And then I thought about the look on Jack's face when he realized he had lost, the way Eleanor's voice had cracked when she understood she had no control left, the way I had finally taken my place at the table without waiting for permission. I set my glass down, exhaling slowly before meeting Daniel's gaze with a smile that held no hesitation, no doubt, no regret. "No," I said, leaning back in my chair, letting the warmth of the moment sink into my bones. "Because for the first time in my life, I know exactly where I belong."